Professor Andrew Pessin, welcome back to the Honest Report podcast. Very happy to have you here. I wanted to jump on a couple things that you talked about last time, which for me were completely fascinating. One was the idea that the Nazis were not only anti Semites, of course, but that they were actually anti Zionists as well. Now, what's interesting is that, as you explored last time, typically, at least today, anti Zionists manifest themselves or are typically left of center. They're typically people who, in a million years, would never consider themselves to be in any way ideologically aligned at all with the Nazis. But of course, historically, we know that the Jews, for example, in Europe, were portrayed as being foreign, as being a foreign implant, Oriental, that kind of thing. Whereas today, Jews are frequently portrayed by anti-Zionists as being a foreign implant in the Middle East, right? Go back to Europe, go back to Poland, that kind of thing. So, and that's, of course, the greatest irony of it is that those who consider themselves to be anti-fascist, Antifa, are in fact ideologically quite close with the Nazis, at least as it pertains to anti-Zionism. So can you unpack that for us a little bit and help us understand exactly what those areas of interlap are?
Thank you for that question. I'm actually writing a book right now on the history of anti-Zionism, which is what got me more deeply into studying the Nazis. And it is fascinating, as you point out correctly. Progressives on campus, in all of their position statements, they say they're against anti-Semitism against all the other hatreds, but of course they're anti-Zionist, so they're not against themselves because they're making that distinction. And Exhibit A of anti-Semitism, of course, it's the Nazis. The Nazis are the most famous anti-Semites of the 20th century, and today's right-wing neo-Nazi white supremacists, are in their wake and still, following that inheritance, so to speak. So that's their paradigm of anti-Semitism. But it's really important to recognize that, actually, let me start with a little anecdote and to make sure I come back to this. There was this happened a number of years ago. I'm sure it's happened multiple times, but I've only seen one recording of this. There was a protest at a church in Texas. The church was, I don't know, doing some sort of vaguely pro-Israel thing. So JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, which is really neither Jewish nor for peace, but nevertheless, the local chapter came to protest that church because this is part of their anti-Israel platform, and were horrified to discover that there were a bunch of neo-Nazis also protesting that church on the same day. And they because they're against the neo-Nazis, and it's somehow the cognitive dissonance didn't register that they're coming together, that they are ideological colleagues in their opposition to the Jews. They want to say our opposition to Israel is like principled and not driven by Jew hatred, whereas the other folks are. But nevertheless, a lot is revealed about you by who your allies are. And so you've got JVP and the neo-Nazis coming together. So coming back to your question, the Nazis represent anti-Semitism. Everyone knows that. But what's important to recognize is that the Nazis are also profoundly anti-Zionist in every sense in which today's anti-Zionists are. The anti-Zionism is actually built into the roots. I trace it back directly to the famous anti-Semitic text, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which everybody recognizes as a famous anti-Semitic text. But they don't recognize it's also a very famous, really foundational text of anti-Zionism. The Protocols, not by accident, is set allegedly. This is, of course, the famous minutes of the meeting where the so-called elders are plotting to conquer the world and subjugate and actually eliminate genocide. The genocide charges trace back to the Protocols, all the non-Jews in the world. This meeting is, by convention, has always been understood to be set at the first Zionist Congress in 1897. So Zionism from the beginning is understood to be part of the Jewish plot to conquer the world. And so the Protocols, which is the most important text of the 20th century, in my humble opinion, which is at the center and foundation of everything the Nazis are doing. They are fighting the Jews who they believe have this plot to conquer the world. Well, what is this plot to conquer the world? Well, it's immediately associated with Zionism. The Nazis understood, and you can trace this back to the earliest days of Hitler. In Mein Kampf, he has a famous passage I could quickly look up where he talks about Zionism, and he understands Zionism is part of the Jewish plot to conquer the world. So they're not merely anti-Semites. They are anti-Zionists. They are opposed to Zionism in every sense whatsoever because they, again, see it as part of this Jewish plot to conquer the world. And indeed, the language that the Nazis used as they, in their propaganda, expressed their anti-Zionism was shockingly similar or identical to today's language. What is the famous language that's two people today are associating with the Soviet campaign against Zionism, Soviet Zionology or Soviet anti-Zionism, is that Zionism is, first of all, it was a bourgeois nationalism. It was ultimately a capitalist endeavor, and capitalism, according to the Soviets, is imperialist in its essence. Capitalism needs to spread to conquer new markets. So the Soviet campaign famously cast Israel as illegitimate because it was part of an imperialist movement, which of course then leads to settler colonialism. It's like the next extension of that concept. So this charge that Zionism is imperialism, people today associate with the Soviets, it's front and center in Nazi propaganda. They see Zionism as part of the Jewish plot to literally capture and control the whole world, and they call it imperialism. They call it Jewish imperialism. And where do they get this idea? From the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, this famous fundamental anti-Semitic text. So the Protocols and the Nazis, deeply rooted in this delusional Jew hatred as expressed by the Protocols, are also instantly deeply opposed to Zionism, using exactly the same allegations and language that the Soviets are going to use later. So when you look at these campus kids who are saying Israel's a settler colonialism, it's Jews conquering territory that doesn't belong to them, they are literally not just repeating the Soviet tropes, but they're repeating literally the Nazi propaganda, which itself comes right out of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion.
Now, the other element, of course, is that you have anti-Zionists today who not only, of course, fail to appreciate, let alone admit, their connections or their ideological ties with Nazis as far as anti-Zionism is concerned, but they will actually try to really invert history altogether and claim that the Nazis were somehow Zionists altogether. Now, on one hand, this is a conspiracy theory without much real significant merit. At the same time, does one simply ignore these conspiracy theories because, what we see as conspiracy theories of 10 years ago all of a sudden are mainstream discourse in the news media and in academia tomorrow? So are these really worth even giving credence to? And if so, then how does one really push back on this kind of disinformation that's being peddled by anti-Zionists?
Right. Thank you for that question. So it is worth highlighting for the following reason, because, and this is what I meant, I think, in our previous episode when I said that anti-Zionism is actually corrupt scholarship or corrupt ideology. It only works by lies, misrepresentations, omissions, distortions. And so this particular allegation that the Nazis were somehow Zionists, there will be this one little kernel of truth to it. And the best conspiracies always have some kernel of truth, right? If you're completely delusional, it's a little harder to get people on board. But if you can point to something factual and tie it into the conspiracy, it's much better. So looking at this will really expose the dishonesty of the anti-Zionists who do occasionally make those claims. First of all, the equation of Zionism with Nazism is part of the Soviet propaganda campaign. That was like front and center in what they were trying to do. And those who do it today will typically point to this famous thing called the transfer agreement. So in the early 1930s, Zionists did make a deal with the Nazis, and that's going to be the kernel of truth here. Look, they're collaborating with the Nazis. They're in it together. And the deal they made was to allow a limited amount of German Jewish emigration to British Mandate Palestine at the time. And this was actually a win-win for both parties, because the Zionists obviously, A, wanted the immigration, but B, also saw themselves as rescuing Jews, because the writing was on the wall to most people as soon as the Nazis had come in power in 1933. And this agreement, I think, dates right to those very early days. And it was actually good for the Nazis for a couple of reasons. One was that there was an international boycott of the Nazis going on at the time, and they were hoping to diffuse that boycott by making this arrangement. And two, they're very clear. They're not Zionists. I just explained exactly how deeply anti-Zionist they are, but they don't see Zionism as any threat to them. They want to get rid of their Jews, so they're happy to let them emigrate. They profit financially because they essentially keep most of the Jewish assets who are leaving. So they're kicking out the Jews and keeping their assets. And they explicitly say, Palestine, there's this little Jewish community there. Yes, we'd be against a Jewish state because that's advancing the Jewish plot, but it's such a puny little community. It's weak. They don't even have the strength to fight the Arabs. So they didn't see Zionism as a practical threat, and therefore were willing to make this agreement. But the fact that they have the transfer agreement does not make the Nazis Zionists by any means whatsoever. And you see that clearly because after the Peel Partition Agreement in 1937, when the prospect of a Jewish state suddenly became realistic, they instantly changed their propaganda to make it clear that it was anti-Zionist. So any progressive advocate today who wants to say Zionists and Nazis cooperated and collaborated and the Nazis were Zionists, they are giving a very, very dishonest spin on this transfer agreement, and they're exposing themselves as the corrupt scholars that they are. So it's useful to bring this to light, I think, in order to expose really the dishonesty of the people who make that allegation.
Professor Pessin, thank you so much again for joining us. It was, once again, a very illuminating discussion.
Oh, it was such a pleasure. I know that was a very big, heavy answer, but there you have it. And it was a pleasure to speak to you. Happy to come back anytime.